There was a reason we studied time more than symbols, more than rituals, more than words. People assume the darkness is obsessed with spectacle, with ceremonies, with fear. That assumption alone kept millions distracted, while the real work happened quietly, methodically, almost politely. I remember the first briefing I ever sat through where the room went silent, not because something frightening was said, but because something obvious was finally stated out loud. Human beings are not most vulnerable when they are afraid. They are most vulnerable when they are tired. That truth governed everything that followed. And if you understand that single sentence, you already closer to the truth than most believers ever get in a lifetime. Because what I am about to explain is about demons hovering at the foot of your bed or shadows moving in the corner of your room. It is about timing and how often you unknowingly surrender ground simply because you did know the value of an hour. When I was inside, we did refer to people as enemies. That language was reserved for those who were alert. Most believers were categorized differently. Predictable, scheduled, reactive. You woke up at the same time, rushed through the same routines, prayed when it was convenient, and collapsed when your body finally demanded rest. From our perspective, that rhythm was a map, and every map has vulnerabilities. The hour I am speaking about was chosen because it was mystical. It was chosen because it was quiet, because resistance was low, because most people had already surrendered their awareness without realizing it. And once awareness drops, discernment follows shortly after. That is not a threat, it is a pattern. One we relied on so consistently that when it failed, entire operations had to be restructured. I can still recall overseeing nocturnal monitoring cycles, watching data come in from different regions, different cultures, different denominations, all showing the same curve. Alertness declining, emotional noise rising, prayer frequency flattening out into silence. You see, silence was never the problem. Silence can be powerful. But this one's silence. It was absence. Absence of intention. Absence of attention. Absence of presence. And absence creates space. Space invites influence. That is how it worked. Not through force, through vacancy. And here's the part most people miss. Nothing had to be added. We did need to introduce chaos. We only needed to wait till vigilance left the room. If this sounds unsettling, it should. But not because you were under attack. Because you underestimated how valuable you are when you were awake. There was a colleague of mine, older than me, far more disciplined, who specialized in leadership targets, pastors, intercessors, people who carried responsibility. His reports were always the same at first: strong resistance during the day, focused prayer, clarity of purpose. But then inevitably the same note would appear. Fatigue window reached. Engagement dropped. Influence increased without resistance. He used to say something that stuck with me even after I left. We don't silence them. We outweigh them. That sentence explains more than any sermon ever could. Because the darkness doesn't need to overpower faith. It just needs faith to step aside for a moment. There is something about the human mind during certain hours that becomes inward, reflective, unguarded. Old memories surface. Regrets whisper. Doubts feel heavier than they did 12 hours earlier. That one's accidental. We tracked it, studied it, built strategies around it. And the tragedy, if I can call it that, is that many believers interpret this heaviness as a sign they should shut down, withdraw, sleep it off. From our side, that interpretation was gold, because the moment you assume heaviness means retreat, you give up the very posture that could have shifted everything. We never feared loud prayers. We feared consistent awareness. We feared people who understood that the night one's a threat, but a responsibility. I need to pause here for a moment and say this clearly, because if you miss this, you will all misunderstand everything else. I am not saying you should never sleep. I am saying you should never be unaware. There's a difference. Awareness doesn't mean anxiety. It means intention. And intention disrupts patterns. Patterns were our greatest asset. Predictability made planning easy. When someone broke their pattern, not dramatically, not aggressively, just quietly stayed alert, everything stalled. Reports got delayed. Influence weakened. Outcomes shifted. And those moments were always flagged, always discussed, because they were rare. Too rare. This is why I am asking you very intentionally to stay connected here. Not because this channel has answers, but because awareness compounds. If you miss what is coming next, you remain reactive instead of prepared. Subscription is about content. It's about continuity. And continuity is the one thing the darkness struggles with when it does control the rhythm. I once supervised a sequence where the objective was to cause failure, but delay. That distinction matters. Delay a prayer, delay a decision, delay obedience. Because delayed obedience often expires on its own. The assignment targeted believers who were sincere, committed, but exhausted. The reports showed something fascinating. They did abandon faith, they postponed it. And in postponement, momentum died. That is why the hour mattered, not because something evil was happening then, but because something good usually was. And the absence of good creates a vacuum far more powerful than the presence of evil. You may be wondering why I am speaking with such calm about something that sounds so serious. Because panic never helped anyone. From the inside, fear was always a poor tool. It created noise, not compliance. What worked was subtlety, familiarity, the slow erosion of alertness. And the church unknowingly adapted itself perfectly to that erosion. Busy days, crowded schedules, spiritually productive daylight hours followed by emotional exhaustion at night. From a strategic standpoint, it was flawless until someone stayed awake. Not physically necessarily, but spiritually, mentally, intentionally. There was one incident I remember vividly because it disrupted an entire regional cycle. A small group of believers, nothing notable on paper, began maintaining quiet, consistent watchfulness during that vulnerable window. No shouting, no dramatics, just presence. Reports came back confused. Influence attempts met resistance. Emotional manipulation failed. The pattern broke. And when patterns break, strategies collapse. When we realize something uncomfortable, the darkness is far less powerful than it appears when it loses timing. Without timing, it becomes reactive. And reaction is weakness. If I were in your position, hearing this for the first time, I would be afraid. I would be thoughtful. I would start asking better questions. Not what is attacking me, but when am I least aware? Because the answer to that second question changes everything. You don't need to fight harder. You need to be present longer. That is it. That is the part no one tells you, because it is not dramatic, but it is devastatingly effective. There's more to say about this hour, about why it consistently mattered across cultures and continents, about why it aligns with patterns older than any modern church structure. But if I go there now, without laying this foundation, it wouldn't land the way it should. What matters for you to understand at this moment is this. Nothing has gone wrong with your faith because you feel tired at night. Nothing is broken because your mind feels heavier then. Those sensations were counted on, planned around. But the moment you recognize that, the equation changes. Awareness re-enters the room. And when awareness returns, the advantage quietly shifts. This is where most people expect me to give instructions, rules, steps, I want tea, because the darkness thrived on rigid systems. Life does tea. Awareness does. And awareness grows through understanding, not fear. Stay with me, because what I haven't said yet is why this hour was never meant to belong to exhaustion in the first place. And once you see that, you'll never look at the night the same way again. There was an assumption we relied on for years, and it worked so well that no one thought to question it until much later. The assumption was that night belonged to rest by default. Not sacred rest, not intentional withdrawal, just collapse. Bodies shutting down, minds drifting, spirits disengaging. From the inside, we understood something that was rarely spoken plainly. The night was never designed to be empty. It was designed to be different. And difference, when misunderstood, becomes neglect. Neglect becomes opportunity. That is how an hour changes ownership without a fight ever taking place. Long before modern schedules, before artificial light extended productivity and compressed exhaustion, the night had a function that went beyond recovery. It was quieter, yes, but not weaker. Quieter spaces amplify whatever enters them. That is a principle that applies to sound, to thought, to influence. In our briefings, this was often described as the amplification window. Whatever carried into that hour, whether intention or distraction, arrived louder. And because most believers carried fatigue into it instead of awareness, fatigue became the dominant voice. Not temptation, not fear, fatigue. The kind that convinces you postponement is wisdom and disengagement is self-care. Did he invent that narrative? We simply benefited from it. I remember studying historical patterns, not religious texts in the way people imagine, but human behavior surrounding them. The consistent thread was tea mysticism. It was attentiveness, watchfulness. The idea of being present when others withdrew. That posture was never popular because it was inconvenient. And inconvenience has always been more effective than persecution. Persecution clarifies priorities. Inconvenience blurs them. That is why so many believers feel spiritually strong during structured gatherings and inexplicably dull during solitary hours. Structure carries you. Solitude reveals you. And the hour we monitored was heavy with solitude. This is where misunderstanding crept in. Many believers assumed that because the night was associated with rest, disengagement was virtuous. But rest and disengagement are not the same thing. Rest restores capacity. Disengagement surrenders it. We counted on that confusion, not consciously, not maliciously, but strategically, because strategy does require hatred. It requires insight. And the insight was simple. If someone believes they are honoring God by withdrawing awareness, they want to resist the influence that follows. They'll interpret the absence of alertness as obedience, not vulnerability. There was a point in my tenure when someone raised a concern. They noticed that certain individuals, scattered and insignificant by most standards, weren't conforming to the fatigue curve. Their bodies were tired, yes, but their awareness remained intact. They weren't performing rituals. They weren't forcing themselves into dramatic spiritual exertion. They were simply present. That presence disrupted assumptions. Influence attempts failed not because they were blocked, but because there was no vacancy to occupy. That was alarming, because vacancy was the cornerstone of our approach. One of my coworkers, younger and more analytical, was assigned to observe these anomalies. He came back frustrated, not angry, not afraid, just confused. He said something I still remember word for word. They are not doing anything impressive. They are just not leaving. That sentence revealed more than he realized. Not leaving meant not surrendering the hour. Not surrendering the hour meant retaining agency. Agency was the enemy. Not belief. Not doctrine. Agency, the ability to choose awareness when withdrawal felt justified. You see, the night presses inward. It invites reflection, and reflection without grounding can spiral. That spiral was one of our most reliable entry points. Thoughts replayed. Conversations resurfaced. Regrets gained volume. None of that needed external prompting. The human mind supplied it generously. And when believers interpreted that mental noise as a sign they should shut down, we simply observed. No force required. Observation was often enough, because interpretation determines response. If heaviness means retreat, retreat becomes automatic. If heaviness means attention, everything shifts. This is why Christians were never meant to be asleep in the way they often are during that hour. Not physically, but internally. There is a difference between resting in peace and abandoning watchfulness. The former strengthens discernment. The latter does it. From the inside, we never confused those two. We exploited the confusion others had. And the longer it went unchallenged, the more normal it felt. Normalization is powerful. Once something feels normal, it stops being questioned. And unchallenged patterns become traditions, even when they erode strength. I want to be careful here because some of you may already feel a sense of guilt rising, and that's not the point. Guilt clouds awareness just as effectively as exhaustion. From our side, guilt was a secondary tool. Useful, but not essential. What mattered was disengagement. And disengagement wears many disguises. Busyness, overcommitment, justified rest, emotional burnout, all socially acceptable, all spiritually costly when they replace awareness entirely. And the hour we are talking about magnified whatever posture entered it. There was a case that still stands out because it contradicted everything we expected. A man, ordinary by all metrics, worked long hours, carried responsibility, had every reason to collapse at night. And yet, during that vulnerable window, he did disengage, he did perform, he did strive. He simply acknowledged the weight, named it, and stayed present through it. Reports came back empty. No traction, no influence, no shift. From a strategic standpoint, it was a dead zone. That was supposed to happen. Dead zones meant wasted resources, and wasted resources triggered reviews. That review led to an uncomfortable realization. The hour itself one's the weakness. Misunderstanding it was. The night one's stealing strength. It was revealing where strength was being placed. When believers placed strength in structure alone, night exposed the absence. When they placed it in awareness, night amplified it. That amplification was dangerous to our objectives because amplified awareness resists quietly, consistently, without burnout, and quiet resistance is the hardest to counter. If I place myself where you are right now, hearing this, perhaps replaying nights where your mind felt heavy and your spirit felt distant, I would condemn myself. I would reinterpret those moments. I would recognize them not as failures, but as invitations. Invitations to stay present when withdrawal feels justified. Invitations to reclaim an hour that was never meant to belong to numbness. That shift in interpretation alone changes behavior without effort. And behavior shaped by understanding lasts longer than behavior driven by fear. This is why I keep urging you gently but firmly to stay connected, to remain engaged with what is unfolding here. Not because information saves you, but because awareness compounds. Each layer of understanding strengthens discernment, and discernment, not intensity, dismantle strategy. Missing this conversation does make you weak. But staying uninformed keeps you predictable. Predictability was always our advantage. When predictability fades, influence loses footing. We used to say that daylight faith was easy to map. Night faith revealed whether belief had roots or routines. Routines collapse under fatigue. Roots hold. And the hour we monitored tested roots relentlessly. Not with force, but with silence. Silence that asked, will you stay or will you disappear? Most disappear without realizing they had made a choice. The few who stayed altered outcomes disproportionate to their number. That imbalance concerned us deeply. There is a reason ancient patterns emphasized watchfulness without spectacle, because spectacle draws attention outward. Watchfulness draws it inward, and inward attention, when grounded, is resilient. It doesn't require energy, it requires intention. Intention survives fatigue better than effort ever could. That is why instruction alone never solved this problem for believers. Instructions exhaust, understanding steadies. From our side, understanding was always the greater threat. As this continues, what matters is not that you force yourself to do more, but that you see differently. The hour does demand performance. It reveals posture. And posture determines influence. The darkness never owned that hour, it borrowed it. And it only kept it as long as no one questioned the arrangement. Once questioned, the terms changed. There is still something deeper beneath this. Something about why that hour consistently aligned with turning points. Why decisions made then carried disproportionate weight. But before that can make sense, this foundation has to settle. The night was never your enemy. Your absence from it was. And the moment you stop abandoning it quietly, without drama, the strategies built around your absence begin to unravel. The mistake most believers make is assuming that opposition looks like confrontation. From the inside, confrontation was inefficient. It required energy, exposure, escalation. The more effective approach was always redirection. If you can redirect someone without them noticing, you never have to stop them. They stop themselves. That understanding shaped one of the most reliable strategies we ever used, and it revolved around delay. Not denial. Delay. Delay is subtle enough to feel harmless and powerful enough to erase momentum. And momentum, especially spiritual momentum, is fragile. It does shatter when attacked head-on. It fades when postponed repeatedly. We learned early that stopping prayer outright raised alarms internally. Resistance became visible. People noticed. Communities rallied. But delaying prayer, that felt reasonable, mature even. I'll do it later. Tomorrow will be better. I am too tired to be present right now. Those thoughts didn't feel like defeat. They felt like wisdom. And that is why they worked. Wisdom, when misapplied, can accomplish what rebellion never could. We did need to plant doubt about faith. We only needed to plant comfort with postponement. And once postponement became habitual, faith slowly lost its sharpness without ever being denied. There was a cycle we documented meticulously. It began with fatigue, moved into emotional heaviness, then into delay, and finally into disengagement. Each step felt small, insignificant, but cycles don't rely on significance. They rely on repetition. When that cycle repeated often enough, it produced believers who were sincere but stalled, committed but inert, faithful but ineffective. From our side, that was a success state, not destruction. Neutralization. Neutralized believers don't resist. They don't oppose. They exist. And existence without influence is safe. One of the most dangerous assumptions we encountered was the belief that effectiveness required intensity. Intensity burns fast. It exhausts quickly. It leaves long gaps of recovery where awareness drops. We preferred believers who burned bright and collapsed hard. The cycle was predictable. What unsettled us were those who did. Burn intensely but stay consistently aware. They weren't dramatic. They did impress anyone. But they didn't disappear either, and that consistency broke the delay strategy entirely. Because delay only works when urgency is external. When urgency is internalized, postponement loses its appeal. There was a moment when I personally began to question the ethics of what we were doing. Not because it was cruel, but because it relied so heavily on ignorance. We weren't forcing anyone. We weren't deceiving overtly. We were exploiting blind spots. Blind spots people did. Know they had. That realization did free me immediately, but it unsettled me, because blind spots aren't moral failures. They are gaps in understanding. And understanding, once gained, collapses entire systems built around absence. I recall overseeing a sequence where the goal was simply to slow someone down. A woman midlife, deeply committed but stretched thin. Every report noted the same thing. She intended to pray. She intended to reflect. She intended to engage. But intention without execution does alter reality. Night after night, execution was delayed. Not abandoned. Delayed. Eventually, the intention itself weakened. Not because she stopped caring, but because caring without action exhausts the will. That exhaustion was interpreted as peace. That misinterpretation sealed the outcome. Not because she failed, but because she never realized she was being stalled. Delay thrives on mislabeling. Fatigue labeled as wisdom. Withdrawal labeled as rest. Silence labeled as peace. Those labels weren't imposed, they were adopted. And once adopted, they shaped behavior effortlessly. From the inside, this was considered elegant strategy. No force. No pressure, just reframing. And reframing changes choices without changing beliefs. Beliefs can remain intact while behavior erodes. That distinction matters more than most people realize. If I were standing where you are now, listening, perhaps recognizing patterns you've lived through, I would feel threatened. I would feel clarified, because clarity restores agency. And agency is the opposite of delay. Delay removes choice by stretching it until it decays. Agency sharpens choice by making it immediate. The darkness feared immediacy more than opposition. Immediate awareness disrupted timing. Immediate presence removed vacancy. And without vacancy, influence had nowhere to land. One of my colleagues once remarked that the most effective believers were not the loudest, but the least negotiable with themselves. They did bargain with awareness. They did debate whether they would stay present. They simply did. That lack of internal negotiation baffled us. Because negotiation creates time, time creates delay, and delay creates disengagement. When someone refuses to negotiate their awareness, the entire chain breaks at the first link. This is why the strategy most believers never notice works so well. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel hostile. It feels reasonable, responsible, even holy. I'll rest now and engage later. But later is an illusion when it is repeatedly deferred. Later becomes never quietly, without drama. And no one notices because nothing visibly collapses. Life continues. Faith remains professed. But influence diminishes. And diminished influence is indistinguishable from peace if you don't know what to look for. We monitored this closely across demographics, cultures, personalities. The variables changed. The outcome did. Wherever delay became normal, disengagement followed. Wherever immediacy was practiced, resistance increased. Not aggressive resistance, passive resilience. The kind that does draw attention but quietly blocks access. That resilience once taught. It was chosen, and it was chosen by people who understood that awareness was something you turned on when convenient. It was something you maintained when inconvenient. There was a shift point I observed repeatedly, the moment someone realized that waiting for optimal conditions was the trap. Optimal conditions never arrive when delay is the strategy. Something is always slightly off, too tired, too distracted, too emotional, too busy. Waiting for ideal conditions ensures postponement. Acting within imperfect conditions restores momentum. Momentum does require urgency. It requires direction. And direction emerges from awareness, not effort. From our side, believers who waited for readiness were easy to manage. Believers who acted while imperfect were not. They disrupted flow, they altered timing, they created inconsistencies in data that could be smoothed out. That inconsistency forced recalibration. Recalibration consumed resources, consumed attention. And any strategy that consumes attention loses efficiency. Efficiency was everything, and delay, when recognized, stripped efficiency away. I want to say this carefully because it matters. The goal was never to make you stop believing. It was to make belief inert. Inert belief does transform environments. It does challenge atmospheres. It does alter outcomes. It coexists harmlessly. That coexistence was the ideal. Loud unbelief attracts focus. Quiet faith that does nothing attracts none. And the delay strategy excelled at producing quiet faith. If you're feeling a sense of discomfort right now, that is not condemnation. It is recognition. Recognition that you've negotiated with delay more often than you realized. We all do. That is why the strategy worked. But recognition is disruptive. It introduces choice where habit once ruled. And once choice returns, delay loses its inevitability. You begin to see the moment of decision instead of drifting through it. This is also why staying engaged here matters. Not because this is the source of truth, but because awareness grows through repetition. When exposure fades, continued engagement sharpens perception, and perception is the antidote to delay. When you see the pattern, you interrupt it naturally. Not through discipline, but through understanding. Understanding does strain, it steadies. There's something else beneath this strategy that hasn't even said yet. Something about how delay reshapes identity over time, how repeated postponement subtly teaches you who you are. Someone who means well, someone who intends to act, someone who will engage later. That identity feels harmless until you realize it has replaced immediacy entirely. But that realization comes next, because once you see how delay operates on behavior, you are ready to understand how it reshapes self-perception. And when self-perception shifts, the strategy loses its deepest leverage. Stay present with this. Not tense, not fearful, present. Because the moment you stop drifting and start seeing, the plan that depended on your delay begins to unravel on its own. What ultimately collapsed everything I once helped maintain was not confrontation, not exposure, not even opposition. It was adjustment, quiet, almost unnoticeable adjustment. From the inside, we anticipated rebellion. We planned for outrage. We adapted to resistance. What we were not built to withstand was a shift in posture that did. T announce itself. The moment believers stopped being predictable, the entire system strained, not because they became aggressive, but because they became unavailable to the patterns we relied on. Availability was always the real battleground. Not belief, not morality, availability. I watched strategies unravel simply because someone altered when they were present, not dramatically, not defiantly, just intentionally. When awareness stopped following convenience and started following conviction, timing collapsed, and timing was everything. Without timing, influence arrives too early or too late. Too early and it is resisted. Too late and it is irrelevant. Precision was our strength, and precision depends on predictability. The moment predictability faded, effectiveness followed. This is the part most people misunderstand. Turning the strategy against the darkness was never about doing more. Doing more actually fed the system. Overextension led to burnout. Burnout led to withdrawal. Withdrawal restored vacancy. The cycle reset. What disrupted it was doing differently. Small shifts, sustained presence, the kind that does T exhaust because it does T strive. Awareness isn't T effortful. It is attentive. And attention, when practiced gently, is remarkably resilient. There was a phrase used internally that never sat right with me even before I left. Low friction compliance. That was the goal. Not obedience through fear, but compliance through comfort. When someone adjusts their posture, comfort loses its grip. Not all comfort, but the kind that dulls awareness. Comfort that numbs instead of restores. When believers learn to rest without disengaging, to be still without disappearing, compliance evaporated. We could work with that. There was no leverage. I remember a sequence where nothing outward changed. Same job, same responsibilities, same schedule. But reports started coming back inconsistent. Influence attempts met quiet resistance. Emotional manipulation failed to gain traction. Fatigue was present, but disengagement won. That distinction made all the difference. Fatigue is human. Disengagement is optional. And when that option was taken, the system faltered. We could force disengagement without exposing ourselves. And exposure was always a risk. This is why awareness alone is disruptive. Not awareness of danger, but awareness of self. When you notice the moment you are tempted to postpone presence, you reclaim choice. You don't need to override fatigue. You don't need to perform spiritually. You simply refuse to disappear. That refusal, quiet as it is, blocks more influence than hours of frantic activity ever could. From the inside, that was infuriating, because there was nothing to fight, nothing to confront, just absence of access. If I place myself fully in your position now, knowing what I know, I would restructure my entire life overnight. I would chase intensity. I would romanticize vigilance. I would start by becoming unpredictable in one small, consistent way, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just to reclaim agency. Because agency dismantles strategies built on habit, and habits collapse when they are interrupted gently but persistently. There was another internal realization that came too late for many of us. The darkness does fear light as much as it fears continuity. Light can be momentary. Continuity compounds. A brief surge of awareness is manageable. Sustained presence is not. Sustained presence forces recalibration again and again. And recalibration drains resources. Drained resources weaken systems. That's how collapse happens. Not explosively, but gradually, quietly, inevitably. I have seen believers exhaust themselves trying to outwork something that only required staying present. Staying aware, staying internally engaged when everything in them wanted to drift. That staying does look impressive. It does get attention. It does trend, but it changes outcomes. And outcomes are what strategies are built to control. When outcomes change without obvious cause, systems destabilize. One of the last things I worked on before leaving was a long-term projection. It modeled what would happen if a small percentage of believers stopped surrendering that vulnerable window consistently. The results were troubling for obvious reasons. Influence dropped sharply. Engagement metrics flattened. The system lost efficiency faster than expected. And the most concerning part was the numbers. It was the lack of countermeasures. There was nothing to deploy against awareness that did. Reveal intent. And revealed intent always backfires. That's when it became clear to me that the advantage was never as secure as we believed. It depended entirely on unexamined habits. The moment habits were examined, the advantage became temporary, and temporary advantages done to survive sustained scrutiny. This is why information matters not as doctrine, but as illumination. Once you see the shape of the strategy, you stop participating in it unconsciously. And unconscious participation was the only thing holding it together. I want you to understand something important here. Turning this around does require you to become someone else. It requires you to stop abandoning yourself during key moments, not by force, by choice. Choice restores dignity. Dignity restores presence. Presence restores agency. Agency dismantles delay, and delay was the linchpin. Remove it, and everything else loosens. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when you stop negotiating your awareness. Not arrogance, not bravado, just steadiness. That steadiness unsettles systems built on fluctuation. Systems prefer extremes, high emotion, low energy, peaks and crashes. Steadiness offers no grip. From the inside, steadiness was a problem we never solved, because it does to respond to pressure. It does to react to urgency. It simply remains. This is why the moment you stop being predictable, the plan collapses. Not because you've won a battle, but because there is no battle left to fight. Influence requires access. Access requires vacancy. Vacancy requires disengagement. When disengagement ends, access closes. Quietly, permanently. And nothing dramatic needs to happen for that closure to hold. If you've stayed with this all the way through, it is not because you were entertained. It is because something resonated. Something recognized itself. That recognition is the beginning of reversal. Not reversal through effort, but through alignment. Alignment with awareness instead of habit. Alignment with presence instead of postponement. That alignment changes how you move through the night, through fatigue, through silence. And once that changes, the hour no longer works against you. There is another dimension to this conversation. Something deeper about why certain moments carry more weight than others. Why decisions made in quiet hours echo louder than those made in noise. But that understanding requires a different kind of attention. The kind that builds over time. Which is why staying connected matters. Not for information, but for continuity. Continuity keeps you ahead, not through fear, but through familiarity with how these patterns operate. You were never meant to live defensively. You were meant to live deliberately. Deliberation dismantles strategies that depend on drift. And drift was the foundation. Now that foundation has cracks. And cracks spread when they are noticed. Stay aware, stay present, and stay connected, because the next layer of this goes even deeper.